amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R.
Without
71.
objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered base text for the purpose of the amendment. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, quickly, this amendment simply makes minor changes to the bill. It clarifies the meaning of the bill and makes it more easily understood. This amendment is not intended in any way to alter the important purpose of this bill. I urge support for this amendment, and before I yield back, I would like to ask for unanimous consent for several documents be entered into the record. The first is a March 20, 2024 letter from freedom fighters to the chairman and ranking member.
Without objection.
The second, Mr. Chairman, is from a February 5th, 2024 letter in support of this bill from NAFA.
Without objection.
The third is a February 1, 2024 letter to the Honorable Brad Finstead in support of this letter, in support of this bill from NFIB.
Without objection.
The fourth is from NSSGA, the National Stone and Gravel Association, dated February 29th, 2024, again a letter in support.
Without objection.
Next, Mr. Chairman, a February 6th, 2024 letter from ICBA in support of this letter, in support of this legislation.
Without objection.
And two more, Mr. Chairman, February 1, 2024 letter to several committees in support of this letter on behalf of a number of state, regional, and local chambers from across the nation.
Without objection.
And finally, an article that's titled Energy and Environment Rules Dominate the Week. This is from AAF Week in Regulation, dated March 18th, 2024, with Dan Goldbeck being the author.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? I think the first hand was the gentleman from Maryland, then we'll come to Mr. Correa. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have questions for my colleague on this, because I'm not exactly clear on the scope of what would be under the purview of the Chief Counsel for Advocacy of the Small Business Administration. And what's the purpose here? I mean, what are the types of regulations that you're trying to get at? And I yield to my colleague.
Thank you for that important question, because the issue here is, as regulations come up from here on out, we want to give small businesses the opportunity, regardless of whether or not we define them in specific scope today, if they have an impact on those businesses, a substantial impact or a significant economic impact to a substantial number of small entities, then those entities should have the right to actually understand what the impact of that regulation proposed is going to be, and then seek redress for it. And frankly, it goes back to that original RFA legislation, and we today simply are saying we want our agencies to follow the law. We want our agencies to do the thing that they were already mandated to do several decades ago.
If I could. So how many regulations, or let's say in the previous year, what's the number of regulations or rules that this entity would have been potentially called upon to review? Because I'm guessing thousands, but you know.
Yeah, it likely is thousands, because when we look at 75% of these regulations not having had this analysis, there certainly is a burden put on the administrative state to justify the regulation. But I think that's part of the issue here is we do not want our regulatory agencies to run amok and get into a situation where they begin to run over our small businesses without evaluating and putting out that information on the front end.
All right, let me just one other question, because I noted the ranking member noted that this position hadn't been filled in, I guess, the past 7 years, which, you know, makes me wonder about sort of the nature of this office. I mean, how big is this office? How big is the staff? What's the scope of what they're doing? Because if you're asking them to be able to review thousands of rules or regulations potentially, I would assume it's got to be a pretty sizable office, not just to handle the volume, but the expertise and the scope of what they could potentially be called to review. And I would defer to you.
Yeah, and I thank the gentleman from Maryland for that point, because the fact that the office of the chief counsel has been vacant for so long is telling, really, unfortunately, that this has not been important to the executive branch of the government to fulfill its obligations that already exist under law. And we need to either go back and say, well, we don't need them to do that, or we need to say, no, this was put in place for a reason, and that's what we're doing here today. Is decades ago when this law went into place, it was for a specific reason, that's to protect small businesses. Let's make it actually happen. Let's give redress to our businesses.
Okay, but I mean, if you pass the law first without building out the office, could that create sort of a bottleneck effect, which I think is, one of the things that the ranking member raised? So, again, potentially you could have 1,000 plus, maybe 2,000 of these potentially. And certainly there's going to be people gaming this. Competitors will, the reg came out that, they think benefits their competitor, somebody else that might then want to challenge it. How do we build this out fast enough to make sure that it can move? Because I'm not seeing where, those sorts of resources and are added here. So I'll defer again.
You hit the nail on the head. Actually, it's about burden and resources, because you're either going to place that burden on government, who by law has that burden to go into right now, or you're going to put that burden on businesses who likewise do not have the resources to deal with these overly burdensome regulations as they come into place. So we do want to stop and pause and slow down before we roll out regulations on small businesses that are going to impair their ability to grow.
Well, fair enough, but if you don't put in an apparatus that can handle this immediately, let's say somebody raises a challenge to a regulation currently, then they'd have to fight the regulation of the small business would have to fight it under the current structure. But with this, you're adding a second layer of potential challenges where, if I'm reading the bill correctly, there's no infrastructure to handle it now. And then there'd still be the second layer to go through that is already in place. Isn't that right?
Certainly, I think we need to evaluate that as it moves forward. But the step one is, let's make it happen. Let's put the onus on government. Let's put the burden on government, not on businesses. And then secondly, if we need more adjudication in that regard, let's see how it pans out.
My time has expired. I yield back.